Welcome, my friends, to the NU Digital Classroom, the coolest class this side of the Atlantic. Should have had that thought up in advance. Hope you're having a good day. Welcome. And in this presentation, we're going to be looking at it's a continuation, obviously, from the last presentation where in chapter 3 we were looking at how the brain is physically developing, and here we're going to look at how that sort of plays out. And what I mean by that is how we see these changes in the physical and cognitive structures of the child manifesting or kind of being displayed through their changing emotional and social world, and what it means to say something like personality development, right? Like this personality, or this, like, which is an interesting word, that there's different styles of people, and that this is something that is an emergent quality, meaning that you wouldn't say a baby has personality. We sometimes actually do say that in common speech. This is a ranty start, because we'll be like, oh, this kind of the baby, maybe you might say that it has like a funny personality or something, but really what we talk about is personality is something that develops a little bit later. It emerges. Emerging meaning coming from within. So that's when you sometimes hear the term, and it's an emergent quality, that it wasn't added, it seemed to come from within the process. And so I'm going to talk about this idea of like how babies are born with basically temperament, and that temperament, which is like how they're different, it's like a building block that's eventually going to become what we call personality, how that interacts with how they're parented, basically, and how that shapes personality development. So emotional and personality development. All right, cheers. Hope you're doing well. It's nice to interact with you. You know, I hope your life's going okay, and that your week's been all right. And grab a coffee. Let's get into it. And only if you drink coffee. You could also have a glass of water, or just ignore that advice. See you on the next slide. So our first main idea for today is that some emotions are more reaction based, and some emotions are more thought based, or like there's different words people use, like self-conscious or other conscious. And I'll explain what I mean by this, but I just want you to think about this for a sec, that it's kind of interesting. So infants that, like, right away almost, babies can show things like surprise. I have it listed here. Surprise, interest, joy, anger, sadness, fear, disgust. Now, what's interesting is almost all those emotions are very reactionary to your environment, contrasted with emotions like jealousy, empathy, embarrassment, pride, shame, guilt. I'll say that list again in case anyone's writing it down, and it's in the note of the slide, but jealousy, empathy, embarrassment, pride, shame, and guilt. Now, okay, I want you to think for a sec about, because remembering the list is less important sort of than, if you get the concept, you'll be able to make your own list, because it's like, until I'm aware that, you know, I'm a person that's different than other people, and that I did something, and that you would find what I did something that you didn't like, and so I should be embarrassed because, and feel guilty or feel shame because you're not approving of what I did. It's like that level of thought's not there at the beginning. It's like a baby's like spills something, they're not like worried about how everybody's interpreting their behavior. It's like that kind of other focused emotion. So I'll just read this to you, okay? But that idea is like that comes a bit later. So my point is that early emotional display seems linked to being more reaction based, and the ones that are more kind of deep thought based come a little bit later. I'll say this a little bit more succinctly. Emotions that infants express in the first 6 months of life include surprise, interest, joy, anger, sadness, fear, and disgust. There's debate about when some of these other ones arise, but like things like jealousy, empathy. So think of jealousy, what that means, right? Like seeing your sister have, I'm just gonna use my own kids because I'll think of my 2-year-old. Say like Charlotte sees Evelyn, her sister, who's 7, having a snack, and she wants the snack, and why can't I have it? That'd be jealousy. Obviously, you know what that is, but we're talking about in infancy. And then empathy, or being able to like, oh well, she liked it, so, oh I like this, so maybe sister would like a piece of chocolate because I like it, she might like it. Like that level of thought, that comes a bit later. That's like a more difficult understanding of who I am, understanding of who you are, understanding of context. These later developing emotions have been called self-conscious or other conscious. So I'll say that again because it's a bit of a tongue twister. Some researchers call that self-conscious emotions, like just the word self-conscious emotions. And some of them are more other conscious. So, and you could almost argue they're both. The baby needs to be aware of themselves, and they need to be aware of the audience for something like embarrassment to make sense. If I do something embarrassing, like if you're on an island by yourself and you do something embarrassing, is it embarrassing? Like, doesn't it being embarrassing demand an audience, or at least an understanding? I don't know, I kind of just rambled that, but I think the point is that some of these emotions demand a more complex understanding of yourself and your social world, and they come a bit later. And it's an interesting way to distinguish early emotional development, that the ones that are more reactionary to the immediate, like being able to be afraid of something, or being able to be mad about something happening right now, or be joyful about something right now, or be surprised or interested in something right now, they're more in the moment emotions. These reflective emotions, other-centered, self-centered, conscious, whatever you want to call it, right? That they seem to develop later. So let me just read that sentence again, because I started to read the sentence and then I just freestyled out of it. These later developing emotions have been called self-conscious or other conscious emotions because they involve the emotional reaction of others. Most experts argue that the so-called self-conscious emotions, what we're talking about here, don't occur until after the first year. And that's a view that's shared by most developmental psychologists. It seems like potentially the structural immaturity of the infant's brain makes it unlikely that these emotions that require quote-unquote thought can be explained in the first year, experienced in the first year. So we think that it's almost like a hardware issue, that it's not like infants the people understand the concept of like your phone software updating, and there's some usefulness as a metaphorical way of talking about this and using language like that it's like the mind's updating, and it's like the brain, because we talked about myelination and stuff like that. A big piece of it is that the brain isn't just growing in size, it's also growing in complexity. And what that means is it's like the processing as software almost. I'm like resisting just using the term software, operating system of the mind. That it's developing. It's eventually going to be able to understand others and have those emotions. It just needs to understand itself and out there, the world, better before it's able to process that, oh, I should care about what you think about what I just did. That's a more complicated thought than a baby's having. At least a newborn, like under 6 months. Okay, so I'm just going to put all the points up here. So you'll see one of the bullet points here is sort of that point I was making about self-conscious emotions seem not to occur until after the first year, influenced by both biology and experience. So again, nature, nurture. So I thought this was a pretty interesting way to say what emotion is. What's emotion? Emotion's basically a feeling or something we are affected by, like emotionally affected by, internally affected by, that occurs when someone's in a state. So when you're in a place or some kind of like interaction that's important to them or to their well-being. And sometimes that's in a positive way. Sometimes you're like, oh, this is interesting. Sometimes you're like, oh, this is, it's like, because when we start to break down what emotion is, it's like experienced in the brain. I have that kind of interesting picture that, and you see in the middle of that picture the letter A, and it says appraisal, and that's where I'm saying that's like important. What do I mean that like emotions associated with things that are important to you? Well, just think about it. It's like if you get a phone call and it's from like a long lost friend and you have an awesome conversation and that puts you in a better mood, or you could have like that same thing could go the other direction. And it's like, but if say like you say, I don't know, say your boss calls and there's some like issue at work and blah blah blah. And I almost lost my point there for a sec, but I got it back. Um, but then think about if somebody calls and it's like a wrong number. They're like, hey, is Steve there? And there's like, I'm sorry, there's no Steve here. And they're like, okay, sorry about that. And you're like, no problem, hang up. It's like you probably didn't respond too emotionally to that. That there's a part of our brain that's almost like judging the significance and the importance of scenarios. And this isn't even getting into yet like the whole like biochemistry around emotions, like actually at like how it's actually like physically affecting. We think of emotions as either things that are like positive or negative, or like being, we think of like being interested or fascinated or being engaged as like more positive and more like, and kids start to do this right away, right? So I say like almost all classified as classifications will designate emotions as either positive or negative. In terms of behavioral organization, which is an interesting way to start a sentence, but like in terms of influencing how the kid behaves, behavioral, and how it organizes its behavior, emotions influence an infant's social responses and adaptive behaviors as they interact with the world, right? So like a kid feels scared of something, so it stops walking towards it. A kid feels interested in something, so it continues walking towards it. That there's this, earlier in the course I presented the word dynamic system theory idea, that like those things are connected, that it's all part of the system, that the interest in the thing and the learning to reach for the thing are so deeply interconnected that that's what it means to say emotions are dictating behavior, is that they're rewarding things, they're penalizing things, things feel good, things feel bad, things feel so. And I want to keep making this point that it's this, we miss the boat if we look at emotions too much as just biochemistry, or if we look at it as just how it's interlocked in our thinking, right? When we think about saying being sad, or we think about being excited and the thought processes around it. So there's a piece of it that's biochemical, there's a piece of it that's thought processes, but there's also a major piece of it that's behavioral and how it interacts with that. And this is highly emphasized in childhood and infancy specifically, right? Because this is when the system's developing. This is the whole rationale for why this is so significant, is that yes, this is always the case that emotions affect, like, are a combination of biochemical, physical, and or biochemical, cognitive, and social and behavioral. Yeah, I just threw the word social in that list too, but that's the other piece of this, that it's like these are now, where I say at the bottom, it's influenced by biology and experience. Well, what's experience? Experience is the social aspect of the child's world, like the whole nurture side of the argument. So I want to try to look at this idea of, and keep coming back to this point in the course, that like in a psychology class, we have a tendency to break things into categories and look at them. But I want to always, at the risk of almost doing it too much, come back to this point of we're talking about a holistic single person who is actually a very complex mix of cognitive functioning, physical hardware that's embedded in a larger functioning system like our body, that's living in a complicated social world, that has complicated relationships within that world. You know, humans are like onions. We got a lot of layers. Okay, next, to quote the epic Shrek metaphor. All right, next slide. Origins of relationship. Think of what, like, if you're into a certain show or comic book or series of books, and then a new one comes out and it's like the origin story of one of the characters, and it's like, well, what would that mean? It means that's where it comes from. Where does, and I know you know what the word origin means, but I want you to think about this idea of the baby's learning what relationship is through its first experiences of it. And through the back and forth interplay between baby and parents, right? That this interaction between parents are reciprocal. That just means back and forth. Like the baby's doing things and the mom's doing things back. Maybe the baby's crying and the mom's comforting the baby. And I'm gonna spend some time today talking about kind of two very core but super important things, like smiling and crying, right? And I'm going to try to make this point that crying is the most important mechanism a newborn has for communicating with their world. And there's reasons why crying is abrasive, right? Like if your newborn cried in a low rhythmic melody kind of way that was nice, it's like it wouldn't wake you up. That there's evolutionary reasons for crying. And yeah, when my first daughter was born, she cried so loud, and I spent a lot of time learning about this kind of evolution of crying even more, because he's way to alert the parent to discomfort. And it's usually around like feed me, change me, comfort me, right? And that the baby's doesn't have the differentiation of messaging yet. It just has a basic kind of alarm signal. And the way mom responds to this in the first year is important. And the way the parents respond to this is what I'm referring to here is this coordinated interaction. These emotion-linked interchanges provide a foundation for the infant's attachment to the parent. So stable differences amongst families will affect the infant's emotional development and the types of attachments they form later. Okay. Yeah, and then I guess, so if you have this point, right? So I'm going to kind of keep breaking this down, this early emotional expression. But from this slide, I really want you to have that idea of how the emotional expression early on is linked to this, and it's developing in this relationship with parents. And that's actually the first exposure to relationship for the child. And it actually is why it matters so much, is it's becoming this model of relationship that then is going to get projected onto future relationships, either in a trusting way or a mistrusting way, right? That's kind of like Erickson's core point about trust or mistrust, that it's from these early relationships, and that's actually the key social, psychological, or psychosocial task. Okay. So some of the points I want to talk about here is like, okay, are these emotions a natural, are they natural, right? Is it nature? Or is it social learning? Is it nurture? And like almost everything, it's going to be some complicated combo. One of the interesting things is we see that kids that are born blind, and haven't even, why this is significant that they're blind is that they haven't they haven't had a visual input of an image of somebody else smiling or frowning. And you'll still see those kids when they're upset frown and when they're happy smile. And that would be evidence that smiling when you're happy is natural and frowning when you're sad is natural and not necessarily learned. Because if it's learned, how would somebody be copying that behavior if they couldn't visually see someone else doing it? So it's just kind of interesting. Even though there's obviously cultural differences around the world, there seems to be like an incredible consistency with facial responses to different emotions. Obviously, like how people express is culturally influenced, but if you were to show like how all the cultures show this emotion and this emotion and this emotion, and you were like to line it all up, you'd actually see a lot more similarity than you might think. But again, then I said that, but culture absolutely does like affect when and where and how emotions are expressed. It's not necessarily universal. It's not the exact same everywhere. Again, the underlying hardware is the same, but the way that nature is expressed is going to be influenced by the culture, or again, culture is just another way to say nurture, the environment, the world. So having kids, there's certain times where I might hear my daughter cry, and I can kind of tell it's her, especially my 2-year-old, let's say. It's like I didn't get what I wanted, so I'm upset cry. And there's times that she's crying where if I hear that cry, I'm like running upstairs right away. The it's interesting how much you can read into the vocalizations that the children are making. We call it crying, right? That I started this point before, but I want to kind of read something. If you can kind of have this idea that there's sort of like a basic cry, like a more rhythmic, continuous cry, like maybe the baby's hungry, and that's different than. And again, it's kind of interesting to think of what physically crying is. It's the baby's attempt to communicate, and it can basically do that by manipulating air with its vocal cords, and sometimes it does it in this more basic way when it's like kind of upset, needs to be changed, needs to be fed. Sometimes when it's angry, that there's this variation of the basic cry, same kind of thing, but it's interesting to think like more forced air. And it's like, well, how's that make sense? It's like, well, what's the difference between you talking and you yelling? The only difference is when you're yelling, you're more aggressively forcing air through your vocal system, right? The difference is in how you're manipulating air. So the difference in a loud cry and a basic cry is how the baby's using this like their lungs / vocal cords to produce sound. Talking. And then the pain cry, this like sudden loud initial cry followed by the holding of the breath. That was like, my daughter Evelyn if she started to cry and then there was like a pause, it's almost like and it's like, oh God. And then what? Like, so that's what that means. This sudden long initial loud cry followed by this like in breath almost. So this would be like if they actually like have a wipeout or something, and I say they're like a pain cry. Cries provide important information about the health of the newborn's central nervous system. Newborns tend to respond with cries and negative facial expressions when they hear other newborns cry. This is kind of a depressing but interesting finding that a study by Jones in 2012 revealed that newborns of depressed mothers showed less vocal distress when other infants cried. Now, to break that down, I have to make a couple points. When mom's depressed, there's a tendency to interact less with baby. People need to know that. If you're ever a mother who is feeling depressed, or if you have friends in that scenario, it's not that the mom's depressed that necessarily affects the baby directly. It's that depression tends to be linked with a reduced frequency to interact with the baby. So if someone's feeling depressed, they really need to know that they need to be intentionally interacting with their baby more than they feel like is the okay amount. That you have to overcompensate in that direction. It's the reduced frequency of interaction, because if then that baby's cries are responded to less, the baby's responding less to the other cries, you see almost immediately that behavioral response transfer or whatever. Yeah. Even I ended that sentence in this note by saying, even for something as basic as crying, early experiences matter. Okay, so if you think about this, just like crying is a signaling mechanism, this vocalization, I really want you to think about, I'm trying to present this angle that look at it as a skill or an ability that the baby is born with naturally, which again, and we already covered this topic of instincts and reflexes. Well, that reflexes are sort of like a behavioral instinct, but there's instincts that are like, well, even again, like a smile. Do you call that a behavior? Do you call that an instinct, an instinctual reaction? And it's like there's, but I wanted to stress this idea of it, looking at it as signaling mechanisms, whether we're talking about crying or smiling. This is how the baby, pre-language, pre-gesturing, well, I guess just those two. I don't know why I set myself up to have three things. Just pre-language and pre-even gesturing. The baby's trying to communicate with the parent, right? And so some of these, so I want to just spend some time analyzing things like fear and things like, so both positive and negative emotions and how it relates to these signaling mechanisms. So we have to distinguish between two types of smiling, right? There's what we call reflective smiling and what we call social smiling. Babies, I thought I had it. Oh yeah, here I got my. Oh yeah, I see it right here. In the first month, as early as the first month, I was looking for where I had that point. That as early as the first month, like basically so right away, the baby in its dreams will be smiling, and it'll sometimes smile randomly. And so the ability to smile is there from, and on this point of how I've been kind of ranting, reflexive smile, right? That it's like, you see how the word reflex is like literally in that word. There's a reflex smile, but then there's also like a, hey, look over here, and the baby, like, I probably look silly doing that, and I did because I could see myself, but hey, look over here, and the baby looks at you and smiles. There's like, that's like a social cue based smile. It's a responsive smile. It occurs in response to an external stimulus. So like, say, like a parent making a smile back at it or doing a funny face. And you see that as early as 2 months. And I want to make a point that, especially if you kind of take away this, like, we're looking at this as like humans, and we have like certain, like, obviously the parent is trying to establish a relationship with the baby, but I want to make this point as like, this is the central behavioral way that the baby is using its full cognitive and physical repertoire to try to communicate with mom. And this is actually essential to establishing this early relationship, that this back and forth relationship between baby and parent, that there's signaling and cueing going in both directions. You see this with, like, I was thinking, like, I should just say this point, then I gotta go. I gotta go pick up my girls, and then I'll have to record the rest of this a bit later. It's getting close to 3. Well, it is 3. I got 20 minutes. I can easily make it in 20 minutes, but I need to wrap up my point. I think I lost my point. That the smiling is core. That it's both a reflex and a response to social cues. That it's one of the baby's most powerful tools in establishing positive bonds and warm emotional connections with caregivers. Oh yeah, I was going to say this. Yes. I almost forgot, but I remember. I was going to say that, like, a lot of dads, and myself included, report this like almost miraculous thing that seems to happen around 6 or 7 weeks. Because for the first, and I can report, just talked of my own experience with both my daughters, for the first like 6 or 7 weeks, I'm basically just the guy that brings the baby to mom. It feels like, right? It's more important, way more important now, way more important. But I'm just saying, like, how it kind of feels as the dad, right? Because, like, the baby, like, wants mom. Mom's the only thing that soothes her. This whole time, the baby's eyesight's getting a bit better. The baby's starting to realize that this person, like me in this scenario, is, like, consistent, is there. And eventually this thing happens around 6 or 7 weeks where baby and dad make eye contact, and there's, like, the first eye contact based smile in the baby. And it's like I'm basically saying it's like basically the best thing. It's basically like the best thing because it's the best thing. Like, the baby is so prioritizing eye contact. I've talked about this before, but the baby's, that's connection. It's a different level of connection. Okay, so I'm going to talk about fear next when I get back later. All right, I hope you enjoy this class. You're a fun group to teach to, so I hope the way I teach this, I want to do more than just like read you slides or just give you articles. It's like a certain amount of that's required to, hit all the demands of topic areas and stuff. And in a course that's like completely remote. Well, you understand the course. I don't have to do like this big breakdown, but just I wanted to say I just appreciate you, and I'm having fun doing this, and I hope you're getting something out of it. All right, catch you on the next slide. With kids, we see fear emerging. It's now nighttime here. It's like 11 o'clock. I'm doing a night shift. Hope you're doing well. Fear, one of the earliest emotions. We see the first appearance of fear in babies about 6 months. Peaks around 18 months. This is a kind of rough point, but one of the kind of sad points around this is that in situations of abuse or trauma, we can see babies display fear as young as 3 months. Which is a brutal thing to think about, right? It's saying basically in situations of abuse, we see kids display fear earlier than they usually would develop that ability. The most frequent expression of fear in kids often involves stranger anxiety, which starts to emerge around 6 months. And it's interesting that this is emerging as their vision is getting better. As their vision is getting better, they're getting more alert to when there's something new in the environment.
Yeah, so I see here at approximately 9 months, this stranger fear gets even more intense, escalates to the first birthday. So the evolutionarily, it makes complete sense why stranger fear, especially fear of other adults, and most stranger anxiety is related to adults, not other kids. Um, it makes sense how evolutionarily that would be the case. But it's interesting how it seems to be also tied to when the kid's starting to get their vision more and more clear. They're starting to be able to actually notice who is and who isn't a stranger. So there's both like a visual component to it and a cognitive appraisal of like, I know this person or not aspect of it. I just have a few more points for you to get down here um, regarding stranger anxiety. That not all infants show distress the same, right? So basically, just kids are different. There's individual variation, social context. So this means like, where I say social context and characteristics of the stranger matter. It's like if the kid meets the stranger and the setting is you coming over to my house and meeting my kid in the living room in a place where the kid's very familiar, then the stranger anxiety is lower. If it's in a situation where it feels a little bit more threatening to the kid, the anxiety might be higher, right? So what the character is, what the characteristics of the person are and what the situation are have a big effect on how upsetting it is to the child. Then that next point, secure infants are prone to stranger anxiety, right? And so it's kind of interesting how babies at this stage have this tendency to really bond with the parent, and in doing that, develop an awareness or a nervousness towards other parents or other adults, particularly. Yeah, so I kind of combine point 2 and 3, but they do studies where it's like kids show a lot less stranger anxiety, for example, when they're sitting on their mother's lap, right? And then a new person comes into the room, it's much less stress provoking, especially since mom's right there as a source of comfort. And then, of course, the other thing is like who the stranger is and how they behave influences the anxiety, right? So if the person's acting really erratic and really aggressively, it's going to make the kid a lot more anxious than if the person's being very like calm and passive, obviously, right? So basically, it's just saying depends on who the kid is, depends on what the situation is, depends on where the interaction happens, who the interaction happens with, and how they're acting at the time. So basically, just the situation matters. Just a lot in dictating how much stranger anxiety you see in the kid. Okay, so the next term I want to talk about this idea of social referencing and how that night shift didn't take long. It only lasted about 1 or 2 slides. It's now Friday morning. Good to see you bright and early in the morning, although this isn't when you're obviously not listening live, so that makes no sense. Understanding your place in the world by understanding how people are responding to you is this new emergent quality in kids at this age, that they start to take reference from their social world. They start to like the easy example of this is like say my daughter doing something, my 2-year-old doing something funny, and then looking at me to see if I'm laughing, and if I'm laughing, then laughing more. That like she's taking some cue from me, she's taking some direction from me into how to interpret her situation. And yeah, so reading emotional cues in others to determine how to act. So all these things, like I say, like okay, soothing helps. Helping. One of the biggest things you're doing as a parent is like helping kids learn how to calm themselves back down, right? How to regulate. How to when a baby's really small and she's crying, and you have to like literally hold her to regulate and bounce like and like rock a baby. But then you want to help the baby develop to the point where they can soothe themselves or self-soothe, right? Like when a baby's small, we even like literally use the word soother for like the obviously you know what a soother is, but the idea is that as the child's aging, you're wanting that ability to self-regulate to become more and more something they can do themselves, self-regulate. Infants are heavily affected by things like fatigue, hunger, time of day, where they are, the people around them. Like anyone that has kids knows that like even a really good kid, when they're hungry and tired, their behavior goes down, right? So I have an awesome 7-year-old daughter, and she's sometimes a nightmare if she's like had too much sugar and she's really tired, right? It's like her biochemistry's off. It's like she's like really stimulated but really tired too. So it's like yeah, like sugar and tiredness for a little kid, it's like it's a tough combo because it's almost like pushing their biochemistry in different directions, um, which usually leads to them not listening very well and being kind of annoying. I love my kids very much, but um, if I'm honest with you, it's like parenting is like the best thing in life. It's like there's 9 million messages in your society telling you to like, oh, you'd have more free time if you don't have kids. It's like, yeah, but you'd have way less meaning, way less legacy, way less family. So don't believe the hype. Infants must learn to adapt to different contexts that require emotional regulation. Like your kid's successful life is going to demand. I just used that word regulation a little bit, like a minute ago. Right? Think of like you're regular, and then you're really upset, and then you come back down to regular. You regulate is sort of where that word means. Regulators. You know the movie. It was a Warren G song, but that's from a movie, Young Guns. The regulators were like that. It's not Billy the Kid, but is it Billy the Kid or is it Jesse James? It's one of the famous outlaws. I love Western stuff. I went through a huge phase of that, but yeah. Anyways, don't add any of that to your notes. That's just me having a weird thought. Regulate means to take from to come back to normal, to regulate, to become regular again. If you had some device in your room that regulated the temperature, that would mean it was like sensitive to when it got too cold and it did something to make it hotter, and when it got too hot, it did something to make it cooler. Like it furnaces, um, yeah, like your thermostat's basically a regulator. It keeps the temperature regular. So you're trying to like, if you could get really upset and kind of through your breath and through perspective calm yourself back down, I would say that you successfully regulated that emotion. Right, and then that last point, just that like as the kid's changing too, it's not like the demands on a 1-year old are the same as a 2-year old, that they're starting to get pressured differently by their society. This is the whole like Erickson point, right? That there's different social, he calls it psychosocial, like different, the development of the psychology of the kid is tied to the pressures of the social environment. And so Erickson thought that psychology and social world go together. He literally used the word psychosocial as one word. You can't divorce your psychology from your world. Your psychology is, again, it's difficult because what's the difference between saying your psychology or your brain or your mind? Those are somewhat different comments. Your brain's like the hardware, your mind's like the software, your psychology is sort of Right, that'd be an interesting question to give you guys as like a thesis topic. What's the difference between the psyche and the mind? Or are those both just the same thing? Okay, I'll leave you with that to ponder. So in this next section, I want to talk about the concept of personality, right? Like, what does it mean? We say this word a million times. Oh, I didn't like this person's personality. This person had a weird personality. This person had a cool personality. It's like, what does personality mean? What does it mean to say that there's different styles of persons? Person styles, personalities. So the first idea I want you to have down is, I want to kind of spend a minute here, if you could have down what's on the screen, and I'll take a second to kind of describe this difference, right? This difference between personality and temperament. And if you look at personality, it's sort of this notion that you're not a new person in every situation, that yes, different situations affect you differently, and that affects how you behave in those situations and all that kind of stuff, but there's a certain pattern to how I interact with people. If you were to look, if you somehow had film footage of all my interactions with people and all my responses to situations, you'd notice a lot more patterns than just randomness, right? That people have certain ways of doing things, certain personalities, patterns of responding to people and objects in their environment. And people's personalities are different. But what we would say is that a baby's not necessarily born with personality. Babies are born with different temperaments. They're different on these 5 characteristics that we're going to talk about. And that the way that that genetic inheritance or that nature interacts with the nurture of the parenting environment shapes the development of personality. So I'm going to kind of make this comment that it's like some kind of like basically temperament times parenting equals personality. And that that's actually a complicated equation, and that's in a complicated thing. I don't know if I should say plus or times, but basically that what your personality is how your nature was nurtured, how what you were temperamentally interacted with your parenting situation had a huge impact on your developing personality. Temperament leads to personality. So let's break down for a bit what temperament is. So sometimes you'll see language like this, put on the Chest and Thomas classifications, but and let me just do this one point at a time. If we look at temperament, then this idea that individual kids have different kind of behavioral and emotional ways of responding to things. And I want you to hear everything I'm saying in response to somebody saying like, well, aren't all kids the same? And me kind of saying, well, no. And it's not that they have different personalities, it's that they have differences. And those differences we tend to call temperament. It's like they're different temperatures. Temperament is like sort of similar to the word temperatures. And I'm going to tell you in a second the 5 things. But for now, if you have this idea that it's these individual behaviors and emotions, these patterns, these early patterns that we notice that are different between kids, right? So Chess and Thompson, this is kind of old, but they have this classification or way of categorizing where they talk about like an easy child. So I would say my daughter Charlotte is a pretty easy child in the sense that, you know, she's generally positive. She's pretty quick to establish routine. She adapts to, like, say, going to my parents, like her grandparents, really easily. Whereas like a difficult child, again, remember, I don't want to make the assumption that like a easy child is a good child and a difficult child is a bad child. That's not what we're saying. We're saying like mainly around like behavioral issues stuff, right? Like that a difficult child tends to like have more difficulty with changing situations, with dealing with new situations, with dealing with new people. It just has more difficulty. It's not necessarily that the child's difficult, it's that the child's having difficulty, reacting more negatively, crying more frequently, with more trouble with routine, more slow to change. Right, and then some kids are sort of slow to warm, just how that implies like they do warm up. They do have a lot of characteristics similar to easy children, except they're slower to get to that stage. They're slower to engage in a new situation. They're slower to adapt to a change. Those kind of things. And that almost sounds like too unscientific until you've had kids and you realize that that's just like kind of how it is. It's like kids are just a bit different, and it's kind of hard to explain how. And one of the main ways that kids are different is in how quickly they adjust to situations, right? Like, does going to the grocery store, does that totally throw them, or do they just kind of, are they like my 2-year-old Charlotte, who's just kind of chill about almost everything? It's like that's a pretty huge difference, right? But that difference is at the level of like style of behavior and style of emotion, right? So back to the original thing, individual behaviors and emotions, but these characteristic ways of responding. So like you can almost see the word pattern there, patterns of individual behavior and emotion. Okay, so now I want to present this. Sorry, I don't think you're hearing it. My daughter's home today on a PD day, and my wife's up there too. But my daughter's teaching her dolls. I could hear her teaching her dolls, but I don't think it's picking up on the mic. Um, so if we were to look at a whole bunch of kids, we could give them all a score on these 5 areas I'm about to discuss. Okay, so just like in later when we're talking about adults and we talk about personality and we talk about the big 5, and I say that like you can have a score on all these big 5 dimensions, like agreeableness, conscientiousness, neuroticism, openness to experience, extroversion. And sorry if I'm a bit yawning, just that my kids have been sleeping brutal this week, so it's been a tough week just sleep-wise. Anyways, kids are different in these 5 things, okay? So the first one is probably the easiest to explain, just activity level. Like some kids are running up the walls, some kids are more calm, and that's they're not running off the walls when they're under 1, but the idea is that right from the beginning, kids are different in their activity level. This tendency to move often and vigorously rather than maintaining passive, right? Or it's basically just like how active they are. The second one, you could almost put in your note like how curious they are, how much positive approach there is, right? And so, or you could say positive emotion. Approach is the word they used to use. Like, so say if there's like a toy, how likely is that kid to approach the toy or the new person? Move towards something interesting, right? And you can see like the opposite of this would be a kid that's very hesitant, which I'm going to talk about in just a second. Okay, so it's like we could give the kid a score on how much activity level they have. We could give them a score on how much approach behavior they have, how much they seek out new things. So these would be the first one, kid. I'm going to give you 5. So activity level, approach, positive emotionality. It's pretty interesting too to think, okay, what we're really saying is that there's differences between kids, and those differences you can see largely, it's not yet developed to the point where we're saying there's personality differences, but we're seeing that in their base temperaments that there's differences, and some of the differences are activity level, some of them are around positive approach, some of them are around what we call inhibition, which is like the opposite of approach, right? This is like how nervous are they to do things? How inhibited are they? The flip side of approach, it's this tendency to respond with fear or withdrawal in new situations, right? Like this tendency to pull back. We think that it's a precursor for shy kids. So often kids that have social anxiety in the teens, shyness in their child years, there tends to be this link all the way back to high levels of inhibition as a child. Right, I'm going to talk a little bit more about shyness in a second. Number 4, negative emotionality. Okay, so now let's go back to the start for a sec. So kids are different in how active they are. They're different in how much they approach new things out of like curiosity. They're different in how much nervousness they have basically of approaching new things and how much inhibition they have. They're different in how much general emotional negativity they have. So like how much they cry, fuss, complain, or loud, or anger, irritable, how much they get frustrated. That's different between kids. And then the last one, they're different in basically how long they can pay attention. And that's a big difference. Like I remember my first daughter, Evelyn, when she was even really young, she would play, like even now, like she's playing, like she has all her dolls set up in the toy room and she's like teaching them some lesson, probably about French. And she's like in this like really complicated play world in her head. And she's been doing stuff like that since she was little. Like some kids don't do that nearly as much. It's like, I would say she's pretty high in number 5 there. So kids are different on those 5 scales, right? And the idea is that how they're different in this way, it's sort of what they're bringing to the table, and then there's how they get interacted with by their parents, and the idea is that that sort of is what leads to personality. These are the, I'm just calling these are the dimensions of temperament. These are what make up temperament, these 5 things. So here's some, if I could have you to have these 3 things, right? I'm going to say like, where does temperament basically come from? And I'm going to say like, well, some of it's genetic, some of it's related to neurological processing, so how the brain's working, and then the next slide I'm going to talk about how some of it's also environment. So why, again, instead of just saying like, instead of just always using the word temperament, we can just say like, why are kids different? Well, it's interesting because when we look at heredity and we look at identical twins, we find that they're much closer in temperament than fraternal twins. So if you compare twins that come from the same egg, where the nature or the genetics is closer to even fraternal twins or siblings more generally, you see that the identical twins are much closer temperament-wise. Now that's interesting because that's an argument that at least some of temperament is straight up nature, right? It's straight up genetic inheritance, heredity. Now, some of the differences also, number 2 there, seem to be related to neurological processing, how the brain's actually working, how the mind's making sense of things, that some kids actually have a lower threshold for shyness. So because it's almost like their brain is setting off the trigger mechanism for being shy quicker than other kids, the way they're responding to their environment, they're quicker to become shy. That's actually a neurological feature. That's actually related to things like dopamine and serotonin, and having these different thresholds for arousal. That's a better way to say it. That it's like, okay, I need to be in front of this many people before I'm nervous, but you only have to be in front of this many. That's a different threshold for being nervous. Right? And we can actually see shyness in some frontal lobe asymmetry, meaning like in the brain, that shyness is in some ways a physical thing. And one of the reasons why, say, for example, a kid might show more inhibition is because the part of their brain that's recognizing threats, and shyness is often a recognition of a social threat, is signaling the alarm earlier, and that's affecting their behavior. Right? So some of it's their heredity, some of it's how their brain functioning is working, their brain activity, their neurological processes. And then the next slide, I'm going to say some of it's also their situation, their environment. So then this brings up the chicken and the egg question. Right, what came first? And remember, if anyone ever asks you what came first, chicken or the egg, the easy answer is always the egg, right? Reptiles predate chickens by a long way, and reptiles had eggs. But that's obviously not the question, right? The question is like, what came first, the mother or the baby? And that's, the ultimate question. But sometimes, okay, so are these differences that we see, is it
Is a kid shy so they avoid situations, or does avoiding situations make kids shy? That's what I mean about chicken and the egg. That it starts to become a bit complicated, because if a kid's a bit shy, and so then it would make sense that they would seek out more situations of maybe solitary play where they're not in those pressured situations. Is that making it worse? So how much of it is, because Sandra Scar there says that like kids start to niche pick, right? So that niche picking just means like a niche means like a specific role. So like if we're gonna all, if there's five of us and we're gonna go play basketball, we can't all play the same position. Like somebody has to guard this person, someone has to guard this person. We have to like play our role. We have to play our niche, have our niche on the team. That the idea is that like people that are really outgoing are going to find situations where they can be really outgoing, and people that are more shy are going to find situations that they can be more shy, and that people start playing an active role in seeking out environments that are matches with their temperament. So then it becomes hard to say what's the environment and what's the temperament, because there's this active third part of like individual choice in it, right? And I say they're like parents can either increase or decrease the effects of temperament. For example, I can give you a good and a bad example. So a good example would be like maybe a kid's really nervous and parents really work with them around things like assertiveness and around things like confidence building and stuff. But that same kid, if they had parents that were really overbearing, could definitely make that shyness worse. So this is a kind of quick point, but I want to stress this because it's super relevant, that one of the reasons that we care about this is because it seems to have predictive value, right? Like if we had these ways of measuring kids when they were 6 months, and we measured them again when they were older, and there was no connection between those scores, we would say those early scores were basically meaningless, right? Like, but if, say, for example, we find a kid that's shy or that shows a lot of negative approach or negative emotionality, and then we see that that seems to be linked to shyness, and we see that that seems to be linked with social anxiety, it's like, okay, well, that's all of a sudden interesting. That's showing that we're maybe actually seeing a real thing when we're looking at it, right? Like the consistency of measurement's important because it shows that you're actually measuring something that's real. And these temperamental patterns seen in infancy tend to persist throughout childhood. We've seen considerable consistency of these measures over age, right? Especially things like measures of inhibition. So that's like the shyness example I just gave, that little kids that are shy tend to be, older kids that are shy tend to be teenagers that are shy. That's not always the case, but it happens enough that it seems like those early measurements are at least somewhat predictive of a pattern. Okay. Inhibition to the unfamiliar. Not just that, again, that's like just a wordy title, but it just means um, that kids start to react to aspects that are unfamiliar with avoidance, distress, or subdued affect beginning around 7 to 9 months. So as kids' visual system is getting a lot better, as they're getting closer to a year old, they're starting to really notice their environment. They're starting to feel, they're starting to kind of like, I guess the way to say it is, they're starting to notice the difference between things that they're familiar with and things that they're not familiar with. And things that they're not familiar with, they show nervousness towards, especially if it's like a place or a person or a hall or like a alleyway or something, right? That like you'll see if there was a dark, this is kind of mixing concepts because this is sort of a little bit of social referencing, but it'd be like if we're walking down the street and there's a dark alleyway, and my daughter, my 2 year old, it'd be very common for her to like look at me before deciding if she's going down, right? Like that she's looking for that social cue that it's okay, because she's noticing that it's unfamiliar, and that actually not getting overwhelmed by feeling nervous in those scenarios actually takes quite a bit of self-regulation, this ability to control your emotions, right? And so I'm saying, like, kids are also different in that. They're different in how much they're able to control their emotions. And this idea, I put effortful control. It's like actually hard to control your emotions. And that sometimes, so I say there's kind of two distinctions. Kids that are like more high in effortful control, they're better at keeping their arousal from getting too intense, better at self-soothing. And then some kids that are lower in effortful control. Remember, effortful control, just this idea that like actually controlling your emotions takes effort. It's not easy, it's not natural. The natural thing is to be emotional in situations, and then the regulation comes almost as a second mature step. And kids are different at their ability to do that. And they can absolutely get better at it. Right, but my point here is kids are different in how good they are at being able to use self-regulation, so being able to calm themselves down in new situations. And so I'm saying here, that's one of the differences why kids would have differences, and maybe one approaches things more and one's more nervous, because they're being affected differently by their own emotions. They're doing different, one's doing a better job than the other at controlling some of the negative emotionality, and we're just seeing that in how it plays out as behavior. Just one last kind of main thing I want to say about temperament, and you might find this kind of interesting. So they talk about some kids have more of an inhibited temperament. Again, just the easy way to say this would be like some kids are more shy and nervous, and kids that are more shy and nervous, or this inhibited temperament, less approaching, more cautious about approaching, seems to be associated with like things that we would very much consider like a stress response, right? Like stably high heart rate, so their heart's pounding. They have lots of cortisol in their blood, which is a stress hormone. They have a lot of frontal right lobe activity, which is associated with processing social situations and sort of weighing consequences. It's like they're very much processing and worrying about stuff. I say their studies suggest heredity has a moderate influence, so it seems like at least some of this is genetically based. But kids can either learn to reduce fear, or as I was saying, in scenarios where the parenting is not as effective, it can get worse. And it can get much worse if dad's not in the home. There's a huge, and I know no one wants to talk about this topic, but there's a huge relationship between dad not being in the home, and anxiety problems, especially in female teens. The child's starting to realize that I like using this. I paused for a second and glitch, but I was like at the beginning of recording this slide, I was thinking like how I wanted to say this, and the way I would define the self is that you're not your thoughts, you're not your emotions, you're not your memories. You're something that has thoughts, has emotions, and has memories. You're yourself. And yourself isn't your identity. Yourself has an identity. Yourself is deeper than your identity. In a lot of ways, it's the most interesting topic in psychology, what the difference between the self and the identity is. That your true self has an idea about what it is, its identity. That's not its true self. Our identity or our persona can get heavily influenced by our culture, by the people around us, by our experiences. But you have an identity. You aren't your identity. You're yourself. As the child's getting older, they're starting to realize that they're their own person.
And I want to spend a few minutes now talking about that.
So this idea of self-concept, right? That I'm like my own person that's different than you, and we all sort of know that because we're adults. It's like, you know, that me and you could go to a movie and watch a movie and I could like it and you could hate it, or vice versa. That we could have our own experiences, that we have our own minds, that we're our own people experiencing time and space, right? That's just meaning like we're going our own people having our own life. But to the infant, remember when the infant's first born, the infant in its mind is basically mom. Like it takes a while to realize that, like, and again, what does realize mean? Because it's not like they're having these like adult level complex thoughts, but they're starting to realize that whatever starting to realize means when you're talking about an infant's mind, but they're starting to realize that they're their own person, that they have their own thoughts and feelings. Again, obviously, like a 9-month-old could never articulate that, but we're starting to notice that they're noticing themselves. And so sometimes with like experiments, you can see that a baby is able to process things it couldn't tell you it could process, right? Because the language isn't there yet. But sometimes you could show it something and by its behaviors read into it. I'm going to show you an example in just a second. All right, so this idea that a baby starts to become aware of its subjective self. So the way I always explain this sometimes at Conestoga is I'll say that, like, if I'm standing in front of the room talking and you're all listening to me and you're all seeing that I'm wearing like a certain color shirt and I'm like a certain amount bald, which is pretty much totally blah, blah, blah. That's objective, right? That's like if you had a video camera on the back of the room, everyone would be seeing roughly the same thing, right? Maybe someone has a visual problem, so they're seeing me like a little bit more blurred or whatever. But in general, a lot of your sensory input around what's happening in that room is the same. However, you're all running it through your own filters, your own brains. So your subjective experience of it, your experience as the subject, is completely yours. The object and the subject. And so this idea that the baby starts to get this idea that they're their own person around, like, as they get close, as they're getting closer to a year, it's about the same time they're also developing something called the object permanence, which I'm going to explain to you on the next slide. So if you wanted to just add in your notes that I pressed end already, so I have to hold the button. If you want to add to your notes that subjective self and object permanence both emerge, you know, as the baby's getting close to a year. So if you look at this, what object permanence means, just think about peekaboo, right? Like I'm like, peekaboo. My Charlotte, this is like, nowadays it wouldn't work. But when she was younger, she'd be like, ah, and like get all happy, and then I go like this, and then peekaboo, right? And it's like, I'm covering up to a little kid that's not at the object permanence level yet. I'm almost like coming in and out of existence. Now, once a kid gets to a certain age, you'll go like this, where's daddy, where's daddy? And they'll just pull your hands down because that trick doesn't work anymore. They realize that you're there regardless, that things exist, that objects are permanent, that things aren't coming in and out of their reality. But you have to remember, to an infant child, that's not obvious. Of course it's not obvious. It's like, it's obvious to you. You're sitting there as like a 20-year-old or whatever and being like, well, obviously, like, the bookshelf behind me is there between now and my next recording. It doesn't just disappear and reappear. But it's like, okay. To the infant, almost everything is sensory motor. Almost everything is in and out of their existence. And it takes a while to realize that things have a permanence to them. That daddy doesn't disappear just because he covers his eyes. He's a permanent object. So you're telling me the teddy bear's still there even though when it's out of sight? Whatever that slide says. Right, that baby at the top, you didn't disappear, you just covered your eyes. This idea that objects continue to exist even when they're not observed. And it's showing that the baby's getting this like more complicated. This is one of the first stages of them getting a more complicated view of the social world. Oh, there is a consistent reality out there. There's a world that I'm living in. It's not just a series of experiences.
um, the toddler, if you can have this idea, right? So I just was talking about subjective self, but the toddler starts to also realize that they're their own person, that they're taller than some people, that they're shorter than some people, that they're a girl and some of their other cousins are girls, but some of their cousins are boys. They'll notice that gender difference as young as 1.5. As soon as kids can talk, they can tell you which of their cousins and friends are boys and girls. It's like the most essential, or not essential is not the word I mean. It's one of the primary categorizations, definitely, and it's also like probably the first one that a child understands. There's a difference between mom and dad. There's a difference between the cousins. And so some of it's gender, some of it's like size, some of it's hair color. But my point is they're starting to notice that they're like people in some ways and different than people in some ways. That they're their own object. They're their own objective self. The toddler starts to understand that she is or he is defined by various categories, such as, that they're a certain gender, they're more shy than this cousin, less shy than this cousin. The child develops this initial self-awareness that delineates the formation of the objective self by the middle. So it's just saying like this is part of this whole process. This is by about the middle of the second year. By late in the second year, a kid can label themselves in several ways. They can tell you what their name is. They can tell you that they're a girl. They can tell you that usually like how old they are. Although my daughter, if you ask her if she's 2, she'll say no, she's 4. She's totally focused on that she's 4. I don't know why. She's definitely only 2, but ask Charlotte and she'll say no, 4. She'll look you right in the face. So she thinks she's 4. Okay, next slide. Now this is pretty interesting because it's looking at, so this is called the Pink Rouge test. So what you basically do is you just put a little bit of like makeup on a baby's nose, and then you put the baby in front of the mirror and you see if the baby wipes it off, right? Because the assumption is that if the baby looks in the mirror and sees it as itself, right, recognizes itself in the mirror, it's going to notice that it has this red makeup on its nose and it's going to try to brush it off. But if the baby doesn't recognize itself and just sees like another baby in the mirror, it probably won't. So that's kind of the rationale. So you see that like the percentage of babies that are 15 months that try to wipe it off is like, 10% maybe. By the time it's to 2-year-olds, it's like 75% of the kids are wiping it off. So you're seeing like this is kind of experimental evidence in the direction of kids are starting to recognize that they're seeing themselves in that mirror. And because they're seeing themselves, they're recognizing the difference, right? They're recognizing that that's themselves with makeup on their face. Wipe off the makeup. Mirror recognition and self-naming develop at almost exactly the same time. Right, and this is an old study. I think you look at that study, 1978. That's actually now, like that's 3 years before even an old guy like me was born. But the mirror study's been repeated tons of times, and I'm going to show you an interesting example of it with animals in just a sec. You're starting to realize all this complexity, right? Like the baby's first realizing that they have a subjective self, they have their own emotions, and then they realize they have an objective self, that they have like these characteristics that are uniquely them, and then they find, I'm going to kind of, as we move through this course, talk about how this understanding of who they are is getting more and more complicated, and it's including like now an emotional self too. The emotional self begins when a baby starts to learn to identify other people, right? And like my baby's getting to that point now, definitely, like, well, is way past that point now, but this idea that like telling how it's almost like to my baby Charlotte, there's nothing that makes her more happy than when she makes like me or my wife laugh, right? There's something very rewarding about that. Babies, as they're getting older, they're getting better and better at reading the cues, right? I say that by like 2 or 3 months, the babies are starting to be able to tell if mom especially is mad or happy. An infant's understanding of their own self advances, and it's matched by this parallel progression in a baby's expression of emotions. So it's this idea that the baby's understanding of other people's emotions
and their understanding of their own emotions and how they act emotionally are all, those three things are all sort of developing together. Right? And then this point I was saying earlier, that by the time a baby's about 1, they start to use their caregiver or their like parents' emotional cues much more in shaping how they respond. Right? And you've seen this in movies and stuff where like a kid falls down and then like looks to their parents, and if the parents are like, oh, it's okay, the kid's fine, but if the parents are like, oh my god, are you okay, then the baby starts like crying. It's like they're taking their intensity cues from the parent, which is why you try not to overreact when your kid has a wipeout, because your overreaction will spill into their emotional reaction. As you can see in the graph is just showing like a more modern, the Amsterdam study, where they sort of tried to recreate the events, and they showed even in a way more dramatic event results. But you can have these points. This is in relation to the recognition in the mirror. Being attentive and positive towards one's image in a mirror appears at about 3 months. So by the time a baby's about 3 months, they're like smiling and laughing at the picture in the mirror. They probably don't know it's themselves yet. We think that by late in the 2nd year, early in the 3rd year, they start to know it's themselves. I'll tell you, my baby's like early in the 3rd year. I guess she's like a little more than 2. I know I've talked about her a lot. But as the topic matter gets to older kids, I'll talk about Charlotte less. Obviously, I'm going to use my own kids as examples because it's what I know. But she definitely has awareness of self. Like, she does things that are purposely silly in front of the mirror and laughs. And so like either sometime before 2 or definitely before 3, kids develop that. And this is linked with everything else. This ability to recognize themselves as their unique person in the world is linked with their developing mental and motor abilities. It's all one thing. They're this massively co-evolving organism where there's like different parts of them developing, and it's all affecting the other types of development. It's a complexity. Okay, so this next video I want to show you something cool. So what it is it's basically these guys put a mirror in an animal conservation park, and so you'll see different animals come up and respond to themselves in the mirror. And I want you to notice how like some of the big cats, like the jaguars, will come up and they'll respond to it as if it's another jaguar. Even the gorillas, right? Even the gorillas you'll see engaging in display behavior, like trying to scare the other one, right? You'll see the chimps though. The chimps like easily know that it's themselves, and they're like scratching their armpits and stuff, and they're like, it's easy to them. Okay, so I think you'll find this kind of interesting.
So now this last kind of point that I want to make is that as the kids getting better at understanding themselves, they're also getting better at understanding others, and they're developing this awareness of others. I say that an infant becomes aware that other people have their own separate intentions, their own internal mental states at about 2 years old. Right, like before when I was saying, you could be sitting there listening and one of you could be like finding what I'm saying really interesting and the other one could be finding it boring. It's like that means you both have your own internal mental state. One's cooler than the other. I'm just joking. But like you know that you have your own internal world. And a child starts to understand that around 2. A child's capacity to pay attention to another person's intentions and an object at the same time. Like for example, me and my daughter reading a book together and us both paying attention to the book and kind of being engaged in this joint activity is a form of joint attention. And that's, so think about that. That means that we're both paying attention to the same thing, joint meaning together. And that is actually related to some really important things coming down the road, like developing language, developing the whole intellectual system, like the whole cognitive system. It's related to behavioral development. It's related to emotional adjustment. That's why reading to a kid is so important, because it's not just the reading, it's the shared attention on the same thing, that when they can direct their attention and keep it on something like that, that becomes a building block for a lot of the cognitive development that's coming later. All right, my friends, that's the end of part A. Part two coming, or A. Part B coming soon. I say there, thanks for being an awesome class. You honestly are. I honestly really enjoy this. I might do a lot of these presentations in 2 parts just because it makes the whole like uploading it and stuff easier, because they're not as monstrous file size. But anyways, have a great day. This is Friday morning at 10 o'clock. I got a dentist appointment, which is brutal, but hopefully this afternoon I'm going to get the second part recorded and hopefully have it out to you either tonight or early tomorrow morning. All right, my friends, see you soon. And if it's going to be tomorrow morning, I'll send a message, but you probably won't get that message. It's not like you're watching live, so you'll probably get it all together. So I probably don't need to say any of this, but anyways, love you, stay well, keep your stick on the ice, see you soon.